Good afternoon. My name is Rosemary Kilkenny. I'm Vice President of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer for Georgetown University. Good afternoon to you all, and it is great to be with you again. Let me extend a warm welcome as you join our fourth discussion in the series of conversations about racial injustice, a movement toward fairness and equity. Today, our conversation is about Black women as voters, candidates, and office holders. Before introducing today's panel, let me set the stage for today's conversation. As many of you are aware, 2018 was a banner year for Black women who rode the tidal wave that swept them into office at the local, state, and national levels. Black women who were once thought to be unelectable proved the political pundits wrong, defeating long-serving Republican incumbents and claiming victories in Virginia, New Jersey, and Alabama. And I have a feeling that we will not only witness our Black sisters repeat the 2018 success in the upcoming 2020 elections, we will see other women following in their footsteps. After Black women delivered some notable advances for Democrats during last term's mid-year elections, they have emerged as a key voting bloc going into the 2020 presidential race. In the wake of the 2018 general election, Black women stand out as a major demographic group with one of the largest voter turnouts. The United States Census Bureau reports that 55% of eligible Black women voters cast ballots in November 2018. But even before that time, Black female voters have been showing up consistently for some time, as evidenced by their historic numbers in 2008 and 2012, when they showed up and cast their ballots for President Barack Obama, voting at a higher rate than any other demographic bloc. In both of those years, in 2016, more than 90% of African American women voted for Hillary Clinton, according to CNN exit poll data, even though they were voting at a little bit lower rate than they had voted in the previous presidential elections for President Obama. As I hinted earlier, when I referenced the Democratic victory in Alabama, among others, Black women showed up for Senator Doug Jones in that state, narrowly handing him a victory over the Republican candidate backed by Trump. They also showed up to vote in the last two gubernatorial races in Virginia as well. In Georgia, More than 1 million Black women voters are registered to vote, and a significant number of them pushed Stacey Abrams to within a few thousand votes of her Republican opponent, Brian Kemp, in a historic gubernatorial election in 2018. Despite targeted voter suppression and systematic disenfranchisement, Black women continue to register and vote at some of the highest rates in the country. The heavy participation of Black women in the electoral process suggests that they certainly take bold steps to run for office themselves and also back candidates whose platforms are aligned with the interests of Black communities, whose constituencies the candidates aspire to represent. This bodes well for the electoral process in many ways, not the least of which are the social policy implications. Although today's focus is about Black women, I will be remiss if I did not acknowledge Latinas as the second largest and second fastest growing population of women of color voters in the United States, going from 7.1 million voters in 2000 to, get this, 13.6 million voters in 2018, almost double in the past 2 decades. Like Black women voters in the 1920s, like Black women voters, the 2018 midterm elections marked a turning point for Latinas participation. Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander women are the fastest growing and perhaps the most diverse racial demographic of women voters in the United States, considering that these voters have roots in dozens of different countries and possess multiples and multitudes of cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds. Can you imagine a coalition of these Black, Latinx, and Asian voters joining forces with white female voters to support each other? I am just blown away when I think of the possibilities. As voters, candidates, and office holders, we will see more of these members of these various groups representing in these categories. That would be a fitting discourse for the next conversation about this topic. For now, though, let's get on with today's conversation. What we have in store for you is timely and a fascinating discussion with Dr. Jamil Scott and Dr. Michelle Swears, whose conversation will be moderated by Dr. Lynn Ross. Let me say a few words about their backgrounds. Dr. Jamil Scott, I venture to say, is probably the most recent faculty member of the three who've joined Georgetown's distinguished faculty. Dr. Scott joined the government department at Georgetown after completing her doctoral studies in political science at Michigan State University. Dr. Scott is a past recipient of the King Chavez Park Future Faculty Fellowship and the Empirical Implications of Theoretical Models Certification Scholarship, as well as the co-principal investigator on a grant that she received with her colleague from William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. She has published in Politics, Groups and Identities and American Politics Research. Dr. Scott is currently working on a major manuscript about Black women's political emergence in state-level politics. Dr. Scott has a lot to share with us about this topic, and she is a scholar to watch. Dr. Michelle Swears is Professor of American Government and also in our government department. Her research interests include congressional elections, policy making, and women and politics. Among her many books that she has authored, examining women's representation in Congress and their influence on policy making, they include The Difference Women Make, the Policy Impact of Women in Congress. Another one of her books is titled Women in the Club, Gender and Policy Making in the Senate. She's also co-author of Women and Politics, Paths to Power and Political Influence with Julie Dolan and Melissa Deckman. Dr. Swears is a prolific researcher and has written numerous articles and book chapters on women in Congress and women in elections as candidates and voters. She is currently working on a project that examines differences in the policy views and support coalitions of Republican men and women in Congress. Dr. Swears provides commentary on Congress and women and politics, a broad spectrum of news outlets. Before turning the program over to our moderator, Dr. Lynn Ross, let me tell you a little bit about her background. Dr. Ross is the faculty director of the Master of Public Management program at the McCourt School of Public Policy. Before joining our faculty, Dr. Ross worked for the United States federal government for almost 15 years, serving in the Executive Office of the President, Office of Management and Budget, from 1994 to 2001, as well as with the United States Office of Personnel Management. Dr. Ross also worked with the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, as well as with the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense. Dr. Ross is a recipient of more than a dozen professional awards in government for outstanding service, something that we desperately need more of in this government. And she also has received other special achievements. She happens to be a Georgetown alum, having received her PhD in American government from Georgetown University. Her academic interests focus on the bureaucracy, the presidency, presidential electoral politics, and budgetary politics. She has written chapters in academic compilations on democratic government and presidential elections. Now let me hand it over to Dr. Lynn Ross. Dr. Ross, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rosemary, and thank you so much for your leadership on this series, Conversations about Racial Injustice. I think this is such a timely topic, and I also would like to say that I think it's wonderful that we're talking about women, Black women in particular, but women in the centennial year in which women received the right to vote. So there are lots of things that are coming together that make this series and make this topic very important. So as Rosemary gave us some great background on Black women and their voting behavior, their turnout, their inroads into making, earning elective office, especially in 2018, which was a banner year. What I want to do is talk to our experts about the three topics that we've sort of highlighted here, and that is voters, candidates, and office holders. And I'm going to go in turn with each of those topics, and then leave it to the group, to the audience to ask questions with about 20 minutes left in our panel. So I want to start by asking Professor Scott to give us any sort of information that you think might add to the texture or information that Rosemary gave us about turnout trends among Black women. We know that Black women tend to be sort of a more reliable group, as it were, in terms of turnout, especially in recent presidential elections. So I'm wondering what kind of turnout trends you think are important as we look historically at Black women, and maybe even as we go into the future.
Sure. So when we think about Black women and their voting participation, we can think about it as what we might say is outsized participation, given what we know about some of the racial and class-based disadvantage that Black women might have to contend with. Black women tend to be very strong participators when we think about their political engagement. And so it has, since the 80s, we can think about Black women as at least voting at 50% or more, right? And even in our most recent elections, we can think about Black women's participation in elections getting up to about 70% or so, right? And in this, when we think about modern political participation or modern voter turnout, right? We tend to think about Americans having a problem here, right? So we can think about Bob Putnam's work in Bowling Alone, right? Where he started to see this decline in participation and he tried to figure out what that was. Well, Black women haven't necessarily had that problem, right? Whereas other groups have seen a decline, right? Black women's participation has been pretty steady and pretty strong, right? And in addition, right, we can think about although given the size of the population, right, we can think about the total or Black women's population size being about 7 or 8%, something around there, or maybe 6 or 7%, right? So if we're thinking about 6 or 7% of the population voting as much as or on par with their white women counterparts, that's really saying something, right? To the point where we see discussions about Black women's outsized participations in the news, right? Rosemary referenced Doug Jones and Black women's participation there, or their role there in pulling out a victory, right? And so particularly when we're thinking about Southern elections, Black women play a strong role in turnout, right? And so when we think about elections more generally, right, there is a turnout gain, and it matters when Black women are deciding to show up.
So what factors do you attribute this dynamic to, Jamil? Why is it that that Black women voters are so prone to turn out, and more prone to turn out, obviously, from the data that you've just shared, more prone to turn out than certainly white women, but the general population too?
Yeah, so when we think about, so from focus groups discussions, right, I think we can break it down to, so there are some generational difference for reasoning, right, that when older Black women, they might think about, or the civil rights movement, right? So in some focus groups that I've done, Black women have talked about the civil rights movement and the fight for voting rights as being an important part of their reason to vote, right? So even though we're even thinking about the centennial year of women's right to vote, right? We can think about there still being a fight even into the 1960s for Black women to be able to exercise the franchise. So for some older Black women, that fight is meaningful, and so that's why they continue to turn out, right? And I would say that might extend to older Black men as well. Indeed, we do see older Black voters turning out more, right, than our millennial voters, right? And so I think amongst younger people, they see it as a duty, right? And an excitement around elections. Certainly, these are the folks who grew up under the Obama administration. So these are people who didn't know any other president, or particularly the younger ones, they don't know anybody but Obama as the president, right? And so that mattered for their development and how they think about the franchise. And indeed, we can think about right now as being pretty contentious, right, in terms of pushing people to vote because of anger, right? Although there was certainly a decline in turnout in 2016, right, Black women were still a higher percentage of voters for Hillary Clinton. So I think there are a couple things going on there. There's duty, right, that they feel the need to have to do this. There's attitudes around or a conviction around the civil rights movement and the franchise and the importance of it. And indeed, I think it'll be questions around or anger about what's happening and a push to vote because of the desire to see change.
Great. Other voters could learn lessons from Black women, it sounds like, quite frankly. Michelle, if I could just ask you to kind of weigh in on what effect you think that Black women have had basically on election outcomes. I mean, it sounds like they're pretty well anchored in the Democratic Party, certainly since we've had the sort of realignment that existed, or that happened when the Solid South turned from Democratic to Republican. But what do you see as the overall effect that Black women voters tend to have on election outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Lynn. And I'm very happy to be here with you and with my colleague, Jamil. So in terms of the effect of Black women voters on outcomes, so over the years, the coalitions of the two parties have changed. So women voters generally had been moving towards the Democratic Party. So when people talk about the gender gap, it's just basically the tendency of women voters to vote a little bit more democratically. In the early years, and it was very much based on civil rights. So in the early years, white male Southerners started moving away from the Democratic Party in the 1960s, and really white women weren't moving as quickly away from the Democratic Party. So most of that movement was based on the movement of white men. Later, you do start to see more women moving towards the Democratic Party. But as the Democratic Party becomes the party that's associated with civil rights, minorities become a much more important piece of the Democratic Party. And so currently, minority voters, highly educated, college-educated voters tend to form the base of the Democratic coalition. And so those are the two groups that you see them trying to turn out more. So in the case of Black women, we can see that Vice President Biden is trying to attract Black women voters with the promise of putting a Black woman on the Supreme Court, and with the promise of putting a woman on the presidential ticket, which many people are pressuring him to put a Black woman on the ticket in response to the moment related to police violence and criminal justice and these kinds of issues. So Black women voters were very important in the race for governor here in Virginia. They helped elect Ralph Northam to the governorship. They helped elect Doug Jones in a surprise victory in Alabama to that Senate seat in what's a solidly red state. So it's very apparent that if they turn out, that's very helpful to the Democratic ticket. One of the things that contributed to Hillary Clinton's loss, and there were many, but one was a decline in turnout among Black voters in areas like Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, Detroit, and Michigan. These are states that she lost by a very small margin. So Democrats want to really create that enthusiasm to try to get these voters out in 2020.
Do you think that Joe Biden does very well among African Americans generally. Do you think that there would be a big advantage for him putting an African American woman on the ticket with him, or is he thinking that kind of strategy?
So I think he probably is. So yes, he benefits from sort of a long history and people knowing him from that history. But it's a mixed history. So there's a certain number of African-American voters who aren't that happy with him over his role in the crime bill in the 1990s, over his status as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee when the Senate was considering the nomination of Clarence Thomas and felt that Anita Hill was not treated properly. When you look at 2016, Biden is associated with Barack Obama, right? And he has often mentioned his association with Barack Obama, particularly when trying to court Black voters. For Hillary Clinton, she was already unusual by being a female presidential candidate. So, there were 5 minutes where I think she was considering Elizabeth Warren or putting a female vice presidential candidate on the ticket. But that would just, at the time, that was just seen as too crazy. 2 women on the ticket is different than 2 men on the ticket. And so let's not get too crazy and make people uncomfortable. So for Biden, he's already, what's been the standard for us in the United States in terms of the type of president that we elect, but he's facing an electoral base that's much younger, much more diverse, and wants to see themselves reflected in the leadership and see the issues that they consider important to be reflected in his policies. And he has to deal, of course, with the more progressive movement that's led by people like Bernie Sanders. And so you see him doing that in his policy platform. So I do think that he sees the potential to choose a woman of color as his vice president as something that's going to attract these voters and make them feel better about voting for him, and maybe mobilize these voters. Because of course, a big part of the mobilization that he's relying on right now is that people are very upset with President Trump more than that people are necessarily in love with Vice President Biden.
Yeah. And sorry to push you into the predictive mode so early, Michelle. I didn't mean to do that, but your comment about Vice President Biden made me think of that. So if we could move to candidates a little bit, I think we've talked about some really interesting issues, and I hope it's been very informative for the audience about sort of the history of Black women, how they vote and what turnout means and so on. I'd like to ask Jamil to talk about the candidate aspect of being a woman of color, a Black woman in particular. What are the sort of obstacles that Black women face in becoming candidates for office in general that might be different from other obstacles?
So I think that there is a question about finance, right? Black women don't necessarily come from money communities, and so there are questions around who supports, not just who is going to support Black women in the voter booth, but who's going to support them when they run, right? And so it's certainly the case that we've seen organizations like Emily's List and their equivalents at the state level playing a role here in supporting Black women, but they don't support all women, right? And so we can see some examples of that in 2018, where they hedged their bets against some women who actually did pretty well, right? And so 2018 was this time when we had an awesome supply, right? There were a number of women running, particularly a number of Black women running. And so the supply was there, right? And there was a willingness and a visibility among Black women. And we see the role of Higher Heights as an alternative, and the collective PAC being an alternative to Emily's List. But in the past, we haven't had that, right? Emily's List has been one of the biggest names in the game on funding women for a long time. And so there are certainly state level organizations, but we can think about them hedging their bets for women who have a greater likelihood to win. So that means that if you don't have the money and you don't have the support, then you're out of the game, particularly when we think about the fact that campaigns have become more and more expensive over time, and they keep getting more expensive, right? Even when we think about small elections, small but meaningful elections like school board elections, right? Money is going to, real money, right? It's going to school board elections. It's not just signs anymore, right? People are spending big money on these types of elections. And so money does matter. And when you don't necessarily have access to it, when you don't have the support behind your name, that is meaningful. And it means you don't really have the chance. So there's that.
So what was the difference then? So obviously you said the supply expanded, and traditionally that's been a huge issue for women, right? There aren't a lot of women in the pipeline, many people argue. And so if you're not a candidate, you obviously can't be elected. What was the difference in the recent election in 2018?
So that's a really good question. So a recent piece by my co-author and Jonathan Collins and I try to speculate about what the role of emotions there from 2016 was to get particularly Black folks thinking about running for office. But what we find there is that Black women are less likely to be angry, right? And so anger is an important predictor for Black men in priming their interest in running for office, but not Black women, right? And that speaks to Kelly Dittmer's work, in which she just produced a piece in thinking about women running, and Black women similarly weren't angry. So it's not anger. In another piece with some co-authors, Nadia Brown, Diane Pender-Hughes, and Lori Fraser-Yoakley, we think about the role of participation more generally. So going from thinking about Black women's outsized participation in the voting booth, does participation in other venues lead to interest in running for office? And we find that to be the case. So I think that because of all of the participatory acts that were going on, right, not just voting, but protests, et cetera, right, it caused more women to think about getting in the game, right? That from participating in these other ways, they thought about getting in the game in a way that emotion wasn't enough, I'll say. that it might have been the case for other women and it might have been the case for Black men, but it wasn't just emotion, it was the act of participating in these other ways that kind of made them think that they could get in the game. And I don't think that's illegitimate, right? That, you know, when we think about American society, when we think about Black women's placement, considering, you know, work by Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, et cetera, we think about how Black women have not always been in the most advantaged position, not always been in the best position, right? And so I guess I would say, as a Black woman myself, there are times where Black women have already been angry, right? And so I don't think anger around 2018 was enough. I think it was these forms of participation that they were already engaging in that pushed them to think, now is the time. I've already been doing this work. Now is the time to get in the game.
Very interesting. Are there other obstacles, Michelle, that you would point to that you think women, and especially Black women, face in becoming candidates or succeeding in electoral politics?
So certainly Jamil pointing out about money, just to sort of put a finer point on it, the average House race winner in 2018, that was $2 million that you needed to raise to win a House race. To win a Senate race, you needed to raise $15 million. So people, you know, there's a reason why there are so many self-funded candidates, so many millionaires in Congress, and the campaign finance aspect has a lot to do with it. The other thing, which is, you know, boring but true, is the incumbency advantage. So we don't like Congress, but we reelect our members of Congress at rates of over 95%. So once you're there, it's a pretty solid job. You know, it's as good as having tenure anywhere. So that means that if you're new to the business, right, it's harder to break in. So what was interesting to me about 2018 was, prior to this, if you looked at the Black women that were elected, most of them came from what are called majority minority districts. So in 1992, based on an extension of the Voting Rights Act, majority minority districts were created to give members of minorities, communities, the opportunity to elect a representative of their choice. And you see more Black women get elected after 1992. So there's a handful of Black women in Congress prior to 1992, and that doubles, you know, after 1992, getting elected in these districts. Two things happened in 2018 that were different. One was that you saw some women deciding, well, maybe I don't want to wait my turn. So what Jamil is talking about here, some of these women that emerged were not the choice of the party, and then they, you know, eventually get enough support kind of on their own through the small dollar donations, through the grassroots campaigning, and they're able to get that support. In some cases, very few cases, of course, because it's hard to dislodge an incumbent, but you see Black women like Ayanna Pressley challenging long-term, long-standing Democratic male incumbents, deciding that in that district, that was a majority minority district, and she wanted representation, she argued, that reflected a change in generation and reflected more of that community. But then third, even more interesting to me, is up to this point, minority candidates had largely been elected from majority minority districts. And in 2018, you started to see some districts electing Black women that were majority white districts. So Lauren Underwood was elected in a Republican-leaning district that it was a Republican incumbent that she defeated in Illinois. Johanna Hayes, a Democratic district, but also a majority white district in Connecticut. Lucy McBath, who, if you know her, it's because of her activism related to gun rights and her son Jordan having been killed, defeated a Republican incumbent woman, Karen Handel, in Georgia. So you start to see more women, Black women, deciding, I'm not going to wait my turn. And you start to see voters, a coalition between minority voters and white liberals, basically, white college educated liberals, electing more minority candidates in 2018.
So again, I hate to ask the predictive questions, because I personally hate when people ask me to predict election outcomes. But what do you both predict for 2020? how do you expect that Black women are going to fare both in the congressional elections and in terms of, you know, where they'll sort of participate at the state level potentially? Obviously, we don't have any Black women governors yet. We've never had a Black woman governor, as far as I can tell. Maybe I missed in my. But you know, are there inroads being made, and what do you predict will happen in the 2020 election in terms of candidates and elections?
So I don't know if we can say that 2020 will be as exciting in terms as 2018. I think there was a lot of buildup around 2018 to be 1992, right? And so I think that the predictions are more temperate this time about what it'll be. But I do think there are more, there will be more Black women running, right? And particularly given the turn of events with COVID-19 and how the presidential performance, right? That it'll be, we might see a Democratic wave, right? Into 2020. And so I think that might be interesting to watch, right? But I think given the increased number of venues for finance, right? The increased interest around seeing Black women run and do well in some of these districts, right? It'll be meaningful and important for their electoral victory. So, you know, like Michelle mentioned, there are some candidates who, you know, and after 2018, we might have thought of, might been in trouble, right? Like Johanna Hayes or Lucy McBath. You know, I figured that maybe that might be one, sorry, my cat has decided to join the chat. We thought that maybe it would be a one-term deal, right? That she would win in 2018, and then maybe you know, there might be some switch up because of attitudes around the presidency, et cetera, right? We know that the coattail effect that, you know, the presidential run and winner, right, does matter for who is able to, you know, win afterwards. So, but given how things are going, right, there's reason to believe that they might be able to keep their seat, right? And some of those decisions they had to make in terms of their voting behavior in the House won't matter as much, right? There was some question about, you know, how progressive some of the decisions the House has made have been, right? Might have been meaningful to push them out, right? I think Michelle is this right that I think it was Lucy Bass Challenger. She started right after the campaign or right after she lost, rebuilding her war chest to run again. And so I think that there was there was a question about their ability to hold those seats, but given how things are shaping up for 2020, I think they might be able to hold it. And I think we might see more women running. Interestingly enough, this will be the last thing I say before I let Michelle give some awesome wisdom here. There have been some, there are some scholars who are doing some work on women running right now, particularly at the state level. Gosh, her name, Pearl Dow, has been doing some interviews with women, and what she's been finding, particularly Black women, what she's been finding is that Black women are shepherding in the new generation. That is, we know open seats matter, right? And what they are doing is saying, my seat is coming open, you run now, right? And so that's really fascinating because we know, right, like Michelle pointed to, the incumbency advantage, right? And Pearl is writing this book, right? And we know that there are these back channels and that women matter for other women in terms of recruitment, right? But what we are seeing and what she is seeing, right, in her work is that Black women are saying, this seat is coming open, it's your turn now, you run, right? And so I think that's a really interesting dynamic that we might continue to see. At least, so we're seeing it at the state, she's doing work at the state level, but we might see that at other levels as well. This, I don't know what she's gonna call it, but what I'll say right now is kind of the lookout effect, you know, helping another woman run and be able to win in a space.
Yeah,
so I'll stop there.
That's a fascinating dynamic. Michelle?
Yeah, so the issue with 2020 is the things that we've been talking about. Women tend to win on the Democratic side, and there's very few women on the Republican side. So Democrats had a big year in 2018. There's only 3 Republicans in Congress right now sitting in seats that Hillary Clinton won. So that's a fairly limited playing field. These Democratic incumbents, like Lucy McBath that Jamil's talking about, they now have to defend their seats. And Jamil is right, Karen Handel won the most expensive House race ever of special elections against John Ossoff, and then lost the seat, right, to Lucy McBath. So yeah, she's ready and she's good at fundraising. So she's coming back. So that means there's a limited number of seats really that Black women can compete for, because Black women run as Democrats. There's only ever been one Republican woman that is a Black woman serving in the House, and that was Mia Love from Utah, and she lost in 2018. So if I'm looking right now, there are 2 competitive seats that have Black women candidates in them. So you have just one this last week, the Texas primary. Candace Valenzuela would be the first Afro-Latina woman in Congress if she was to win, but it's a Republican-leaning district. And then Peter King in New York is retiring, and the Democratic candidate there, Jackie Gordon, is a military veteran and a Black woman. But so there's limited opportunities because of incumbency, because Democrats have already kind of maxed out, the seats that they're going to be competitive in. But like Jamil is pointing out, you do have to look at lower levels too to build that pipeline. So the state legislators, there are 7 cities of the 100 largest cities that now have Black female mayors. And so that's a source of candidates. In 2018, there was a really interesting phenomena where they elect judges in Texas, and there was a district in Texas that had 38 district judges elected, and 19 of those judges were Black women. And I saw all those memes about Black girl magic, right, after their election. Well, Veronica Escobar, a Latina woman in Texas, I believe she was a former judge, right? So you could see some of these women potentially running for Congress or higher level seats. So I think the pipeline's being built, and the more people see someone like themselves running, the more there seems to be legitimacy for that, then the more women you see taking on that cause.
Yeah, perhaps a critical mass effect, right? So yeah, we're not even mentioning the Senate, right? There have only been 2 African-American women to serve in the Senate ever.
Right, Carol Moseley Braun and Kamala Harris, and both of them ran for president.
Right, yeah. Right. Oh yeah, good point. Good point. So maybe the pipeline is getting wider. Okay, so let's, in the last few minutes before we open it up, I just want to ask you all a little bit about office holders. So what we know about Black women when they actually hold office in terms of the effect that they have. I'm going to date myself and say that, Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan were heroes of mine growing up. I know you 2 probably weren't even born, but what do we know about the effect that Black women have when they hold office? What are their policy preferences? What do they tend to achieve as office holders? And we can start with you, Jamil, and then maybe move to Michelle.
Sure. I'll go with the state level perspective. And so when we're talking about state level politics, there are states where we see first, there are states where we're more likely to see Black women to be, right? And those tend to be southern states, right? And so the conventional wisdom would be that those are the places where we would be less likely to see women more generally. But when we think about Becky Scola's work, for example, it's the difference there is that we're more likely to see women of color in the southern state legislatures and white women in some of these northern legislatures when we're talking about at the state level, right? So there's that point where we're seeing women run and win, women of color, particularly Black women, run and win, right? So the size of the population matters. So for instance, we'll see more Black women in the legislature in Mississippi. There are more Black people in Mississippi. So that matters there. but as for what they do when they get into office, that's really interesting, right? Because we tend to think about women's issues, and sometimes I think we think exclusively about these things that only women legislators can do, and they do those, they do cater to, or there are women's issues that women do focus on in their career, but I think when we're talking about Black women, there might be a more expansive definition of what we're talking about when we're talking about women's issues, that we see them take on other issues, right, that that may not look like women's issues, but in some way are related, right? So we might see Black women taking on factors such as criminal justice, right? That may not seem like a women's issue, but when we think about Black women being affected by criminal justice, the criminal justice system, when we think about Black children being affected by the criminal justice system, that's a women's issue, right? And so there's an expansion there in terms of what we're thinking about as a woman's issue, right? And they're thinking about these things, right? But that's not to say, so there's a Black women being at the crux of, or at the intersection of these two identities of Black and womanhood, right? That in therein, right, we're expanding the definition of what counts as a woman's issue, or traditionally, right? And so they take on a number of issues at the state level that I think are really interesting, and things that we wouldn't traditionally think of as, you know, the women's issue, like education or healthcare, et cetera. And certainly they do focus on those issues, but I think there's a bit of an expansion there that we see at the state level in terms of the things that they focus on and the things that they make issue priorities.
Great, thanks. Very interesting. Michelle?
So those are all excellent points that Jamil makes. And most of my work has been about studying what's policy differences and what's the impact of electing women to Congress, so I can speak most to Congress. As Lynn pointed out, Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman elected to Congress in 1968, and actually did meet her. I carried her bags as an intern, so there's my
Oh, that's awesome.
Yes. But so once you get into the 1990s, that's when you start to see more of these Black women get elected. And what's interesting about that is Congress runs on seniority. So some of these Black women now have leadership positions. So Maxine Waters is the chair of financial services. And compared to other chairs, Maxine Waters is a lot more focused on affordable housing than other members of that committee have been in the past. And then you have new members like Johanna Hayes, who has the experience of living in public housing. And so she is also focused on the issue of affordable housing, and particularly how it affects minority communities. So what you see happen is these women come in and they vote like other Democrats vote. So there's a lot of research on whether, you know, it matters if you elect a person with a certain background versus just elect a Democrat. And these days, Congress is very polarized. So we do know that Democrats are going to vote one way and Republicans are going to vote another way, likely. But the issues that they champion are different. So after 2018, when Lauren Underwood comes into Congress, she decides she's going to make Black maternal health a very big focus of what she does. And so she and Alma Adams from North Carolina, who's been there longer, they started the Black Maternal Health Caucus. And we know that this is a big issue. So just in the last week or two, the CDC released data that in 2018, that for Black women, the maternal mortality rate was 37.1 deaths per 100,000 live births. And when you compared that to white women, it was 14.7 deaths per 100,000 live births. So this is a particular issue for this community that everybody would say, yes, this is an important issue, but you have to have somebody that wants to champion it, that wants to bring it, the attention to it, that wants to bring it to the table, because there are just so many issues that Congress could be dealing with and giving attention to. So what we see now from these women is that, as Jamil said, they do have this different perspective, bringing in the perspective of gender, but also the perspective of being from minority communities that makes them look at issues a little bit different. So when Congress dealt with welfare reform in the 1990s, it was the Black women that were fighting against the stereotype of the welfare queen. And then as now, it's the Black women that are championing getting rid of the Hyde Amendment which says that Medicaid cannot be used to fund abortions because they are concerned that the right is meaningless if you can't pay for it through health insurance. So that's where we see the sort of the lived experience, bringing your lived experiences to the policymaking table makes other members of Congress say, oh, I didn't think about this issue before. You know, maybe I should think about this from this direction. And so that's where we see more of the difference coming through in the issues that they bring to the agenda and champion there. And then you also now have Karen Bass, who is the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. And of course, she's been very engaged in the criminal justice issues there. And she represents the district and represented it in the State House during the riots of Rodney King in the 1990s. So this is an issue she's been dealing with for a long time.
Great. I want to turn it over to some questions that we've gotten from our participants. So the first question has to do with the ambition gap. So the question is, has there been an ambition gap style research done looking for differences between white women and women of color deciding to run for office? So is there some knowledge that we have about any ambition gap between white women and women of color for running for office?
Sure. I think when we consider the question of who's interested in running for office, from what we know about from the research from Fox and Lawless and others, right? I think this is a twofold question. It's not just are you interested in running, but also are you going to actually engage in the act? So when we think about the gap, there is a gender gap here, right? But from folks like Monica Snyder and Miria Holman, we see that Black women are, I guess the best way to say it is that Black women are they haven't closed the gap, but Black women are, you might say, show more ambition in experimental work than their other female counterparts, right? And so they're interested, right? And in my research, I see a similar effect that Black women are indeed interested in running for office. And we might say their participation pushes them to think more about running for office than other women, right? But I think thinking about running for office, well, not just I think that I know, thinking about running for office is a different game than actually getting into the race, right? And so we know that they've thought about it, but then there are these other obstacles like the party, like the money question, et cetera, that we know more generally women are less likely to be recruited by the party, but women of color in particular are especially less likely to be recruited by the party. So it's not just are you interested, right? It's does the party support you? And do you have additional mechanisms to go around the party? So we can think about groups like Emily's List and some of these other PACs as being a mechanism that might allow women to go around the party, right? But that also requires that they show you support, right? So we talked about Ayanna Pressley, for example. She didn't get the Congressional Black Caucus support. She didn't get the Emily's List support, but she did get Higher Heights support, and she did get the Collective PAC support. So there was other support for her, but what if you get support from none of those groups, right? And we did see, and I think this is the important thing that we don't often consider when we're talking about who's running for office, right? We always talk about the winners, but we don't talk about the losers, right? So there were Black Republican women, there were Black women at all levels of office, Black Republican women, Black Democratic women who they ran, but they were in no way successful, right? Because the support wasn't there. And the barriers to entry are less at the local level or at the state level, right? But there are still stakes to be lost, right? And so you're still able to lose, right? And you can lose by a large margin, right? And so we might see it at the primary, and some of them lost very much at the primary level, right? So in 2018, there was this website, Black Women in Politics, where there was just a grassroots effort of collecting information about Black women who were running for office. A number of those women lost in the primary. right? So we didn't even see them in the general election to be able to consider them as a major candidate. So I think there is, so yes, there is an ambition gap, and I'm not here to deny that, but I think that there is an argument to be made about where Black women stand in the ambition gap. So in how they're thinking about, or if they thought about running for office. And then there's a question of, can you actually get into the race, right? And the limits that exist around that. So I'll stop there.
And all the constraints that you face as well, as we've discussed. So the next question is about the political trajectory of Black women leading in the suffrage movement, but not exactly gaining the privileges of voting following the 19th Amendment, obviously, Jim Crow and that period, preventing many people from voting. Can you talk to the barriers that exist for Black women in that regard? And then I guess the second question is about predicting a viable Black VP candidate. And it doesn't say necessarily women, so maybe just a Black VP overall. So the first is about Black women's sort of influence in the suffrage movement.
Okay. So we are at the time of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. So there's a lot of material going around on that now. And it's pretty well known that a lot of the leaders of the major suffragist organizations were white, upper middle class women who felt that they deserved the vote. So the suffrage movement starts out with abolitionists and women's suffragists kind of in coalition together in trying to fight for voting rights as human rights. And then you get the turning point of the 15th Amendment, which causes a split in the movement, because at that time it puts the word men in the Constitution that says men should not be denied the right to vote. And the thought at the time was, well, if you got Black men the right to vote, since the Civil War was about slavery, you know, eventually that would come to women. And so that creates a certain split in the movement. And then also, as time goes on, you know, the late 1800s, the 1890s, we get a large wave of immigration. And so you see a good number of people who start making arguments about the reason to give suffrage is to counteract that uneducated immigrant vote. And so if you read some of the papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you would see some fairly racist arguments about how it would be nice to have a literacy test and these kinds of things, because she'd been studying the Constitution for years and years. And here she's very upset because these people can just come in, immigrants coming in fresh off the boat, and they'll sell their vote to, political machine candidates, and she can't vote. So it becomes somewhat of a dark period. Then as there gets more momentum for suffrage, at the time that Woodrow Wilson is the president, you're just about there. There was one strategy where they're trying to get states to pass it. And there's one strategy where they're trying to get the federal government to pass it as a constitutional amendment. And if you look before the federal constitutional amendment, you would see that a large number of the states that never passed women's suffrage were the southern states. So these white female leaders, were faced with a bit of a conundrum, because here you are arguing for suffrage and for everyone to have rights. And then even within the suffragist groups in the South, those white women did not want to enfranchise Black women. So there's a very famous march that happens in Washington, D.C. And one of the famous Black women who's involved with suffrage, Ida Wells, she gets told she's got to march in the back, right? And that if she's gonna be marching, and she's a very accomplished woman. If you've heard her name, it's because she drew a lot of attention to lynchings and documented lynchings throughout the South. And she gets told she has to march in the back. But if you also look at the map, you'll see that before the federal amendment gets passed, those states were not passing it. So, it was a very, difficult time, in that here are these white women and they're really not standing up for everybody's rights, but also they weren't winning those rights either in these strategies. And then of course, Black women get the right to vote, but Jim Crow settles in, and then they really don't get the right to vote, right? And so Black women have been fighting for the right to vote, through the Voting Rights Act. And one thing that I've found very interesting is that, you know, there's still discussion about voting rights and voter suppression. And it's very interesting to me that Stacey Abrams, you know, loses her race for governor in Georgia, and plenty of Democrats lose their race for plenty of positions and for governor. And she goes and starts an organization about voting rights, right? The Fair Fight organization, where she is fighting not just for, you know, her own political future, but for the future of voting rights and enfranchisement and making sure that people can cast their votes. Of course, she was running against someone who was the Secretary of State of Georgia at the time, and he had a little influence on who got to vote. But it's still, just the fact that that's kind of where she went with her political energy, I think is telling about the importance of voting rights and how long Black women have been fighting for voting rights.
Yeah, it's a brilliant segue, I think, to the second question, because I was thinking of Stacey Abrams when the question of, you know, a Black VP candidate, running mate for Vice President Biden is asked. So maybe Jamil, you could predict, do you think Stacey Abrams is a viable candidate for VP, or is there another African-American woman that you think Joe Biden should put on his ticket?
So I really like Stacey Abrams. Some of my work focused on her run for governor. And so I think that when she, so I think Joe Biden and his team has been doing this really interesting thing of testing a couple of people and putting names out. And so she had a really great segment with him on CNN. But I think that one thing about American voters is that they love to see a family. And so I think that one of the things that might be working against her is that she is not married, right? And I think if we're just talking about Black candidates more generally, I think that worked against Cory Booker as well, right? That we tend to see when we're talking about who's running, right? We see candidates, and we see candidates with their family, that as, you know, families are American as apple pie, right? When we think about it, that we don't often see candidates who are single rise through the ranks, right? And so I think that might be a hinge for her. She's brilliant. I think she's an awesome candidate, but I think that'll be the hinge for some people, right? And so so her not being married, I think will raise a question for some people. And I think the question of Joe Biden being an older person, right? Vice president makes her not just a potential president for the next go round, right? Because people are trying to get him to commit to just run for one election cycle, but he's older, so that will put her in the mantle of the presidency. So I think people are considering that as well. That's not to say I don't think she's qualified, but people tend to put up a lot of roadblocks about women's qualifications that we don't see about men. And so I think that some of the things that make her brilliant might work against her. And some of the things that make her accomplishments even great, right? Really great, right? They might work against her, right? The not being married, the getting really close in Georgia, but not being the governor, right? That was an amazing race, and she's shown really great ability to campaign, right, and to build a coalition, but she's never been a governor, right? She's been a state legislator rather. And so those are factors that people might use against her in her ability to be a VP pick, right? So when we, so for instance, when we think about Barack Obama, for example, right, he was a state legislator who just got to the Senate, right? He was just in the Senate for a little while, and then he decided to run for president, right? He was a senator for 2 seconds. And so nobody ever brought that up, that he didn't even have time to sit for a bill passage, right, before he started running. And so, you know, he was a senator from Illinois. And so that gave him clout in his ability to run. Whereas I don't think people will use that lack of state clout, right, as not being a state senator or not being a governor against her. And so some other names that have come up, I think, have been Val Demings, Kamala Harris, and I think they're brilliant women and they've accomplished a lot, but I think what's against them is, so I think there's a very interesting thing to be said here. I think that older Black voters will vote for them, but I think the question then becomes younger Black voters and this time point in the context in which we're in, right? We're in a time in which there's a strong calls for criminal justice reform, right? And so because of that, right, Val Demings has a history of being a police chief, right? Not a popular conversation to be having right now. Kamala Harris, a history as a prosecutor, also not a popular conversation to be had right now. And so because of their implication, because they're implicated in the criminal justice system, they don't seem very popular, right? And so I think he'll have issues with younger voters because of that. I think Susan Collins has come up as well, and I think she might be the most interesting choice and might be a different choice.
Susan Rice, you mean?
Susan Rice, not Susan Collins, I'm sorry. Susan Collins is from
Susan,
Maine. Susan
really?
Rice is, sorry.
Breaking news.
I totally meant Susan Rice, sorry.
Wow, a split ticket.
Yeah, sorry, I totally meant Susan Rice. Susan Rice, associated with the Obama campaign, has a PhD, has a lot of foreign policy expertise, and I think that moving forward, that might be really important and really interesting. Sorry, I feel like I've talked for way too long. I'm gonna let Michelle weigh in.
Yeah, anything you wanted to add to that, Michelle?
So I think that Jamil has it well covered, but in terms of sort of trying to predict who it would be that she hasn't mentioned, I think that one thing that Biden is thinking about is, if I'm only going to run for one term, contrasting himself to President Trump and his lack of experience, Biden is trying to show I have experience. And what's interesting right now, and Jamil mentioned the downsides of Kamala Harris and Val Demings and their background with criminal justice, is we seem to be at an inflection point, because I would say from the civil rights movement and from the Vietnam era and then those protests, Democrats have always felt that they're seen as weak on defense and weak on crime. And the way that you counteracted that was to show, oh, look, I have a background in foreign policy, defense policy, or I have a background working with law enforcement, right? So being a prosecutor was a positive thing. And only now in this current moment is it now suddenly seen as potentially problematic and could demobilize particularly the more progressive elements of voters. So I think that Biden probably still tends to think in the format of experience. And so I think that another reason maybe he won't go with Stacey Abrams is because he might think that she doesn't have enough experience yet. And a reason that he's looking at Susan Rice is because she has foreign policy experience and he knows her from the Obama administration. So I can see him, potentially picking somebody like a Kamala Harris who has experience in the Senate and the experience as a prosecutor, as someone that he sees as sort of the middle ground in trying to bring these different elements of the coalition together. But, we'll have to wait and see another couple of weeks.
Great. Well, I've been told by our timekeeper that we're a little bit over. So I guess all that's left for me to do is thank my esteemed colleagues and friends for participating in this really interesting panel. I think Rosemary maybe wants to say a few closing words about the series and what's coming next, but I have learned so much from you two today. I can't help but think that our audience feels the same way, even though we can't see them. They're there with us in cyberspace, but this has been a fascinating conversation. And Jamil and Michelle, I want to thank you again for participating in this and sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us. This was great.
And let me echo Dr. Ross's comments. This has been a wonderfully inspiring and informative session. And we certainly look forward to seeing how the 2020 elections play out based upon everything that we've learned today. Let me express my gratitude to the three of you, to Dr. Ross, Dr. Scott, and Dr. Swears for this wonderful talk and your insightful analysis of the political landscape and what we're facing in a couple of months. Please join us for next week's conversation with Dr. Benton and Dr. Ndwizu, who will be talking about the manifestation of racial injustice in income inequality, gentrification, and redlining. And Christopher Murphy, our Vice President for Federal Relations, he will be moderating that panel. And again, a warm thank you from all of us in IDEA for the wonderful talk that you gave us today. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Have a
Thank
good
you,
one.
Rosemary. We enjoyed it.
Thank you.